Welcome to African History Times. Before we begin today, we would like to state the following proviso. This episode will be slightly different from our other episodes, in that it contains both history and also some of our opinions at African History Times. But those opinions are still arrived at based on historical facts only. We'll be talking about China, and we will offer a warning for Africa for what we see happening as China gets more and more entrenched in Africa. As China is set to becoming a world power, it is only fair to compare it to the current superpower, that is, the United States of America and America's cronies in the West, Europe. Please note that we have no preference between China and America, and we are also not haters of China. What China has achieved economically in the past 3 or so decades is phenomenal. We are also admirers of the long and interesting history of China, and what we'll be saying about China on this episode is not inherently anti-Chinese. It is more so pro-African and what is good for Africa. Also, if we seem pro-American, we apologize up front. What we will be saying about America is not praise of America per se. Again, we are thinking about what is best for Africa. The China we'll be talking about is the current communist Chinese state, which came into existence only in 1949. Chinese history does not begin in 1949, and hopefully the communist state of China will not last forever. We would very much prefer that Africa would stand on her own 2 feet and not require the help of any country. But unfortunately, that is not reality. Now that the long proviso is out of the way, let us begin. As you may have seen in the news in the past decade or so, China is investing a lot of money in Africa. We don't know what China will really be like towards Africa once she feels she controls enough of Africa's economy and resources to start making unreasonable demands from African countries. What we know for sure is that Chinese control of Africa could be of the most autocratic and cruel kind. China is cruel to her own people. China is a one-party state. The Communist Party of China does whatever it wants over there. There are no media freedoms. One need only look at how China has been treating their small neighbor, Tibet, for decades, or how China treats their Uyghur minority. When you talk about this, some Africans say, well, how is control by China going to be different from the unfair behavior of Europe and the USA in Africa? At least the Chinese are not the ones who have been ravaging Africa since the 16th century. Of course, China wasn't involved in the colonization of Africa, and we have no intention of defending the wrong actions of Europe and the USA, and we certainly have nothing personal against China. The West has done horrible things in Africa, from slavery to colonization, to installing odious African dictators and removing those dictators when they were no longer suited for the purposes of the West, all the way to post-colonial trade practices and loans that are unfair to African nations. But we need to mention a few facts which apply to the West. The way the West governs itself today is not perfect. And of course, their past systems of government allow slavery, colonization, and other serious policies which were detrimental to Africa. However, with that said, let us look at some examples of what the Western governments have had to deal with in the past 7 or so decades from their own people. We will use the example of the USA since that country has been the prime representative of what people call the West. When America engaged in an atrocious war against North Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, it was the USA media and the US population that put pressure on the American government to stop the Vietnam War. I don't mean to belittle the fighting efforts of the Vietnamese, But the truth is that the American military did not lose the Vietnam War on the battlefield. The war was lost because the American public and the American media did not want that war any longer. The government and the military of the USA would have definitely liked to continue the war, and they would have liked to fight the war without the restrictions that were brought about by public opinion. So a small country was saved by the peculiarities of the American system. Look at the case of George W. Bush's Iraq War that began in 2003. The American media told the world about the abuses that were taking place in Iraq. Incidents like the infamous case of prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib prison made Bush so unpopular that it partly led to Bush's Republican Party being replaced in a landslide election loss in 2008. Another example related to the Iraq War. Because of the vigilance of the American media and the relative openness of the American political system, Bush's administration had to come clean when they did not find the weapons of mass destruction. Through the American media and the American Congress, the whole world learned that the Bush administration was handing out the contracts for the rebuilding of Iraq in a corrupt and non-transparent manner. Can you picture such a thing happening in China? Of course, the Iraq War did happen, and that is a tragedy. But the media and public fallout from that war is such that the American government has not started another war since. In the 1970s, the CIA's abuses across the world, including in Africa, were investigated and kept by the US Congress and reported on heavily by the US media. In fact, the government was forced to hold hearings with regards to the CIA shenanigans in the third world. Can you picture China's leaders being inconvenienced in this manner? In the 1980s, former US President Ronald Reagan found himself in trouble for secretly selling weapons to the Contra rebels of Nicaragua. The US media broke the story, and the US Congress held hearings on the matter, and the people were able to find out the truth. July of 2020 was the 21st anniversary of the US bombing of the small Balkan country of Serbia. Former US President Bill Clinton's bombing of Serbia is still held to scrutiny to this day. US presidents get criticized even for cases to do with Israel's abuses of Arab countries. In very recent times, the US media strongly criticized former President Trump for Saudi Arabia's killing of a reporter in Turkey. Speaking of Trump, the US Congress held impeachment hearings against Trump for his bullying of the Ukrainian president. One could argue and say that all these above-mentioned American cases of criticizing the sitting administrations were self-serving and politically motivated attacks by the then opposition parties and their media acolytes, meant to destroy whichever party was in power. One can also say that the people in the US who made these attacks against the various sitting American governments did not care about the small and powerless countries being abused. That all those attacks were part of the internal political battles inside of the USA. And that is probably true. The Democratic Party in the US probably didn't care about the Ukraine. They maybe impeached former President Trump with the intention of destroying Trump and the Republican Party. But whatever those selfish US internal political reasons might be, the point for the Ukrainian people is that Trump was held accountable for taking advantage of their country. And the Ukraine, just as it is the case in Africa, has no means of punishing a US administration for abusing their country. So we are not analyzing the entire American political system here, but rather the cases that the American government had to deal with other countries, especially small and helpless countries. As we have seen from the few examples above, American politics are such that helpless third world countries have been saved by the American media, popular opinion, and the party that was in opposition. On the other hand, China is not known for such self-immolation. In China, the Chinese Communist Party is the only entity that is allowed to criticize itself. And in cases where criticism takes place, it is mostly done in secret behind closed doors. We hardly ever hear about it. Who will bring the Chinese leadership to task if they decide to negatively leverage all this money they are giving to Africa? Who will protect us against China? China is a country that in recent times banned a cartoon character, Winnie the Pooh, because some few reporters jokingly said that the Chinese leader looks like Winnie the Pooh. If China decides to secretly engage in shenanigans, say in Mozambique, for instance, will the Chinese media reveal that to the world? Will there be hearings in the Chinese parliament on behalf of Mozambique? Chinese reporters are frequently jailed for even showing slight independence of thought and opinion. The Chinese Communist Party has been known from time to time to throw their own under the proverbial bus. But those people who were thrown under the bus had lost favor inside the party. People who had ran foul of the party's ruling elite. So, as China continues to replace the West as the primary investor in Africa, we need to ask ourselves what the implications of that will be. We Africans always like to say that colonization by the West never ended. All that happened is that colonization became more modern, more sophisticated, and more nuanced. And indeed, the West has not always played fair with Africa in the post-colonial era. But with China, based on that country's recent history and even its present behavior, something more ominous and odious is in store for Africa. We have come to the end of today's episode. Thank you for listening. Please support us by sharing and liking our episodes.